Hey folks, thanks for joining me again for Grace with Paul Gray. We've been talking these days and are going to continue to talk about what words mean to God. And they don't, almost always don't mean the same thing to us because we tend to limit them. Today I'm talking about salvation, wholeness, being saved, being included in God's family forever, how that is just part of what grace is and what grace does. Remember, grace is the best possible free, lavish provision for all people. That's what God means when he says grace. When Jesus did his public ministry for 3.5 years, the Jewish people, his people, were still under the old covenant of the law of Moses. That didn't change until he died. So Jesus had a dual-track ministry to the Jews and to all people. Track 1, Jesus acknowledged Jewish law, and by his teaching, he actually raised the bar of that law so outrageously high that it was obvious nobody could get right with God by keeping the rules. Nobody could keep the rules except him. Track 2, Jesus introduced, lived, and demonstrated and taught grace to and for everyone. Not just the Jews, and that was scandalous to them because they believed they were God-chosen people. Not just to those who believed, not just to those who did the right things or said the right words, but Jesus taught and demonstrated grace and salvation for all people. The Apostle Paul gives the definitive message on this in Romans chapter 5. I'm going to just give you part of one verse, Romans 5:20. Paul says, the law was introduced into God's plan to bring the reality of human sinfulness out of hiding. And yet, wherever sin increased, there was more than enough of God's grace to triumph all the more. All the more comes from a Greek word, pleonazo, which is sometimes translated to superabound or exist in abundance or to be augmented. My first book, The Fishnet Experience, was a novel about God's superabundant grace that exceeded everything people could imagine and was always way more than enough for all people. God's grace superexceeds sin. The sin of the entire human race cannot exceed God's grace. Well, that was scandalous to the Jews. And unfortunately, it's still scandalous to most religious people today. Pure grace drives religion crazy. Because with true grace, religion can no longer control people. And that's what was going on with the Pharisees in Jesus' day. True grace is for all and to all, and it's all one way, coming from God. There's nothing for us to do, nothing required on our part. It's not fair, it's not logical, it has no favorites. It's not just for religious people, it's for all people. Today I'm going to give you 3 quick Bible stories about who God's grace was for. First, Saul. Grace forgives people who are totally against Jesus and not even open to hearing about him, the worst of all. Saul hated Jesus and Christians, and he murdered people. He knew what he was doing. He was very religious, but he didn't know Jesus or his Father or the truth. He wasn't even looking for Jesus. But grace, Mr. Grace, Jesus was looking for him. And Jesus appeared to him. Unconditional love and grace immediately changed the hardest heart in the world at that time. Saul wasn't looking for Jesus. He didn't repent. He didn't say magic words. He didn't ask for forgiveness. When Jesus showed up and God revealed to Saul that Jesus had always been in Saul, he said, okay, what next? Christians then and now are offended by grace being that good for that kind of person. The Christians then, they were not happy that Paul was accepted by Jesus. And, of course, the Jewish people weren't happy with him either because he rejected their religion. Along the same line, the Roman soldiers who tortured and crucified Jesus and the religious leaders who demanded that they do it, to them, Jesus simply said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. See, grace reaches pagans and religious people, even when people are angry and hurtful and mean and destructive. Okay, those are two stories grouped into one category. Second was the thief on the cross, a guy who had committed crimes worthy of death in that society. The Romans didn't like him. The Jews didn't like him. The guy who had, he was a bad criminal. But Jesus included him in paradise, in heaven, the very day that he died. His grace extended to him. Third, finally, Peter, one of Jesus' three closest friends, the first to know that Jesus was the Son of God, and God the Father revealed that to him. He was the guy that Jesus picked to be the first leader of the church. Well, Peter denied Jesus 3 times in a short period of time in Jesus' time of greatest need, even after that very day pledging to be with him to the end. Jesus' grace covered him. Jesus didn't even bring Peter's denial up to him. Not a word. He didn't have to pay. He didn't have to, nothing. Now, the point of these collective stories is that grace, which includes being saved and salvation, is to all kinds of people, no matter who they are or what they have done. So never believe religion's lie that you or anyone else is not included in God's grace. We'll talk about this a little more next time. See you then. Thanks, everybody.